All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll go ahead and get started here. Today we have a great opportunity to hear some words from Major General Christopher Beck. It's going to be a session focused mostly on protection. And then, sir, anything else that you'd like to impart upon us, we would definitely be interested in hearing that. Across the room, you have representatives from Compos 1, 2, and 3, all flavors of different MOSs for our warrant officers. And really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So thank you for that. So by way of introduction, Major General Christopher Beck currently serves as the Commanding General of the Maneuver Support Center of Excellence in Fort Leonard Wood. Prior to this assignment, he was the Deputy Commanding General of Maneuver for the 3rd Armored Corps. Over his distinguished career, Major General Beck has held command and staff positions across the United States, Germany, the Middle East, and Central Asia. His tactical experience includes leadership roles at the 19th Engineer Battalion, the 130th Engineer Brigade, and the 4th Infantry Division. At the operational level, he has served as the Chief of Engineer Planning for United States Central Command and the Chief of Staff for MISCO. Major General Beck has also been an integral part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, where he held numerous positions, including Commander of the Southwestern and Transatlantic Divisions. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point and holds multiple master's degrees in engineering and strategic studies. His awards include the Distinguished Service Medal, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, along with a Combat Action Badge, Air Assault Badge, and Parachutist Badge. Major General Beck is a registered professional engineer and certified project management professional. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Major General Christopher Beck.
Appreciate it. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will tell you that it is truly my honor to be here today. I think, so Chief Anderson, thank you very much. I'm pretty sure that the reason I was asked to be here was I still have PTSD. When I was a second lieutenant, I will never forget my CW3 maintenance tech. As we were in the motor pool, if I saw him coming, I would run quicker than if my battalion commander was coming. So this audience scares the snot out of me, so just know that. But no, I really appreciate the opportunity. I have had an interesting opportunity, as you heard in my bio. Prior to this job at the Maneuver Support Center of Excellence, I was with 3 Corps. And really, I saw a little bit of a difference, and I want to talk a little bit on my perspective of a Command Chief Warrant Officer and what, from a TRADOC perspective as a Center of Excellence, what I get the value in that. So I'm blessed to have Dean Registe as my CCWO, the first one we've had at MISCO. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means to me as a commander, because frankly, I'm still learning about it. To be perfectly honest, about a little over a year ago, my Chief of Staff came to me and said, hey, we think we can have this opportunity to have a CCWO. And I was a little bit confused as to what I would gain from that. So if you're not familiar with the Maneuver Support Center of Excellence, I'm very fortunate to have underneath our team the Engineer Regiment, the Chemical Regiment, and the Military Police Regiment. And each one of them has their regimental warrant officer, who basically works for the proponent, who is the commandant. And then at the COE level, they roll up, and all of them feed to the center, but then we, as the center, are also the proponent for the protection warfighting function, which is what I'll talk about a little bit later. And so the question I asked my team was, what am I going to get out of having a CCWO? What does that do that I'm currently not there? And to be quite frank, the answer they gave me was valid, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But what they didn't give me, and I didn't fully grasp, was what I look for as a commander in a CCWO. As a TRADOC person, the value that I get from having a CW5 sitting right down the hall from me is absolutely unparalleled. I firmly believe, not doctrinal Chris Beck's opinion, but I firmly believe the value, so I view it as inverse lines. When I look at a W01, a CW2, even a 3, they're still very technically focused. And as that technical line trends down as you become more senior, that leadership value line trends up. And I talk more, so as a geospatial expert, yes, I talk to my CCWO about geospatial equities, but that's probably about 10% of the time. probably about 90% of the time, I talk about center-level equities, and frankly, I talk about leadership. Because that W5 brings a perspective to me as a commander, and frankly, to my command sergeant major, that we don't otherwise have. That position sees things that we don't otherwise see. They can see whether it's, and we were just talking recently, whether it's the ability to integrate training. Hey, let me pull the warrant officer cohort into the training with the young lieutenants or captains or the NCOs that are going through the NCO Academy, because they need to learn together. They need to figure out how to treat each other, how to work with each other, and the value each other brings. The other piece to that is the perspective and experience. I have a very, and you all heard the Chief of Staff of the Army, we've got to have a sense of urgency. We've got to get out of our own processes and stretch them as far as we can to accelerate our modernization. And my CCWO, personal skills, but the professional experience that you all bring to the table, he's able to say, I got it. So here's what we're trying to do formally. Sir, have you thought about this? Here's how we can get there in the near term and maybe do a little bit of experimentation with it. And so just the value of having that as an advisor who sees a different level, just the ability to bring the experience to the table and ensure that we're thinking about it. Because at the end of the day, it also changes how we discuss, in our particular case, we've got 3 different regiments worth of warrant officer PME going on at Fort Leonard Wood. How do we bring them into the dialogue? And is our PME relevant, not only for the technical aspect, but are we ensuring that those young men and women, as they grow up in the warrant officer ranks, are the leaders that we need in the next generation? Because it's not just a matter of, are you a technical expert? But like I said, I kind of view it as inverse curves. And in many cases, you all as technical experts immediately talk to senior commanders, whether at the operational strategic level. And so your ability to bring that message together and give advice is really, really important. So as a CCWO, that is a critical, and frankly, one that I didn't clearly understand, but a critical capability and a critical position. And I'm very fortunate to have one of the best I've ever worked with. So despite the fact that privately I give him a lot of crap about everything, he is an absolute asset to, more importantly, not just Fort Leonard Wood, but the United States Army, as we try and deliver at Fort Leonard Wood what the Army needs from us. So the second thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, and again, I'll field questions about any of this, but the second thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was protection as a warfighting function. So our team has worked really, really hard in the last year to educate the force. And I'll talk a little bit more about the slide you see in front of you. Frankly, it's going to stay up there the whole time because really what I want you all to think about when you think about protection is a couple things. Number one, protection is everybody's business. I'll steal from General Rainey, the AFC commander. If you have not heard him speak, he routinely says, we can be seen anywhere on the modern battlefield. The key is when you're seen, not to be understood. And so obviously I'm parochial, but I firmly believe that protection is the cornerstone, because if we can't protect our force, we can't fire, we can't maneuver, we can't sustain. Now, that does not mean protection is more important than those other warfighting functions. That's not what I'm saying at all. All of them have to work in concert. And I would challenge you all, because frankly this has been a learning curve for me, we cannot be stovepipe in the Army the way we have been over generations. There is no such thing as one of those functions working independently. If we don't understand how to leverage all of them and to make use of all of them on the battlefield, we will not survive. So number one, protection is everybody's business. Number two, we took the protection definition. So if you haven't looked at ADP 337, I would challenge you to. I think it's a good manual. Not just because we wrote it, but that does play into that. But I think it's a pretty good common sense manual. And one of the things we really spent some time on, because as I left 3 Corps, I learned a lot of painful lessons that I personally screwed up. I didn't understand protection. So we haven't changed the definition, but we kind of broke it down a little bit to make it easier to understand. And so about the same time we published ADP 337, the Army published the Army Protection Program, AR, I think it's 5-250 or something like that. I should probably check my notes. But the point of that is that's out of the building, a very important program. And we're part of that. The two have to be intertwined, but it's not necessarily the warfighting function. It's much more policy-driven, and so we really kind of wanted to break that out because what we were doing is we were confusing the friendly. What I'm not going to show you in this, but you've got the slides are in here, is there's 16 pillars to protection. And when you show that to a commander or a senior leader, their mind immediately goes, okay, we're not focused anywhere. Yeah, next. So what we tried to do was take that down and break it down a little bit. And so we really looked at protection from 3 different bins. The first, based on the Army Protection Program, is the institutional. We tried to take that and say, okay, that's largely, frankly, the Provost Marshal General responsibility. He and I had a great discussion about it as it looks at policy and some of the installational protection capabilities that, again, I don't want to confuse that with homeland protection, which is extremely important, but some of the things about how do we automate gates or something like that as an example. So the other 2 bins or buckets are really where we focused as the warfighter. And the first was foundational. And I say that so you all have probably heard, and if you haven't, I steal from the Sergeant Major of the Army all the time. One of his favorite taglines is to be brilliant at the basics. And to be frank, as an Army over the last several decades, we lost that capability. Our ability to do field craft, our ability to do basic things like know how to put on face paint, we've lost that. We don't know how to dig a personal fighting position. Frankly, a lot of us don't know how to put a camo net over a vehicle. Those fieldcraft skills, those survivability skills, and I am not pointing a finger at anyone, and I'm pointing it right back at me, we lost those skills. We don't know how to go to the field and do that anymore because that wasn't what we did for the last 20 plus years. So it wasn't we failed, it was a reality of our operations, and we just needed to refocus that. So that was foundational. And again, that gets back to it's everybody's responsibility. And the last piece of protection, and this is where I think it's most important, particularly as we look at senior leader levels, or, in this case, probably division and corps level, but certainly applicable at echelons above and below that, is what we call the operational level of protection. And so, do I have any targeting warrants in here? Any ADA folks? Okay. And I don't even know if you count. I know you too well, so you'll. But this is where, frankly, we get crosswise with a lot of the artillery and ADA folks, and there is no intent to do that at all. So we define loosely, this isn't in the manual, but we define operational protection as the synchronization of kinetic and non-kinetic effects to protect an asset, activity, or capability, asset, or activity throughout the depth and breadth of the battlefield. And the part that gets crosswise is there's a lot in the ADA or field artillery community that feel like, hey, we may be competing. And I would argue, and have argued, we are not competing. We have got to be complementary. We absolutely have to be complementary. And the reason I say depth and breadth of the battlefield is, and oftentimes people think of, well, if I'm thinking about protection, I'm thinking about a division or a corps rear area. And yes, I will absolutely readily admit, so again, non-doctrinal, but my perspective is there's 2 synchronizing functions when it comes to that higher tactical or operational level of war. And those really are, in my mind, targeting or fires and protection. And I think when you look at the close and the deep fight, that targeting, that's really bringing everything in, and protection supports it. When you look at the rear fight, I think it's led by protection, and targeting supports it. Again, does not mean that things like sustainment or other functions are not as important. They absolutely are. But protection and targeting largely bring in all those different pieces to enable success in those other warfighting functions. And if we don't do all of them correctly, we will not be successful in the battlefield. But when I look at targeting and protection, and I can say this, so again, going back to my time at 3rd Armored Corps, we were absolutely focused. As the M, my 100% focus was targeting. Absolutely. My boss paid me to kill stuff on the battlefield, and that was it. And I had one of the best CW5 targeting officers I've ever worked with in my career, who I still talk to periodically. They knew the process. The problem is we were trying to invent a new process with protection. And the reality is it's the same thing. So I'll way oversimplify it. But targeting is bullet going out, protection is bullet coming in. And the reality is the targeting process is a time-proven, very well-refined, very well-experimented, very well-proven process. It starts with intelligence. It goes through the process. And you figure out on the other end what you were successful with or didn't have an effect on through assessments. And protection is no different. You start with intelligence. You figure out what's important to protect. You allocate resources, and you assess your success or failure. It's the same thing. And so one of the things we've got to update in our doctrine, like I said, I think ADP 337 is a really well-written document, but one of the challenges we have is the prioritized protection list is a little bit ill-defined. And I say that because for those of you that have worked with a PPL before or anything like that, anytime you call it a list, it fundamentally becomes static. And so we're going to protect this wet gap crossing. Or we're going to protect this bridge. That's one of my favorite. That bridge is not going to move. The problem is, we don't, just like targeting, we don't have enough assets on the battlefield to do persistent protection throughout. So for those of you familiar with targeting, their TT Lodak or their fighting product at the fires level, the PPL's got to be the same thing. It's got to be time-informed. It's got to be an activity, event-based document so that we are allocating resources based on the threat, based on the priorities, and based on risk. And again, and you all know this, the reality is commanders at the division and corps level, they don't make black and white decisions. If it's a black and white decision, it was made somewhere else. They're making risk-informed decisions. And so that's what we want to be sure we communicate is the risk when it comes to protection. And it's got to be kinetic and non-kinetic. Again, I can speak to the warfighter that 3 Corps did a few years ago, but frankly, I've been to about 10 or 12, maybe 15, either warfighters or CTC rotations in the last year, and it all comes down to a lot of the same stuff. We are challenged with our ability to communicate risk because we don't necessarily understand whose risk it is. And so we get very bogged down. And so one of the initiatives that Chief Regis has worked really hard on is a protection warrant officer. And so some of you are thinking, well, what do we need that for? And that's a great question. And I view it exactly the same as a targeting warrant officer. That technical capability, that consistency to understand the process. Because when you look at protection, successful protection, and I can say this, so I'm over top of chemical, MP, and engineers, like I said. And the reality is people often lump that as protection because, well, we put maneuver support all at Leonard Wood, we put everything that does protection at Leonard Wood and call it good. There's a lot more that goes into protection. And again, back to everybody's business. People often just, hey, ADA is protection. No, ADA is an asset of protection. Engineers are an asset of protection. I would argue cyber is an asset of protection. Space is an asset of protection. Those are all capabilities that can have an effect on what the enemy is trying to do as we protect. And so that protection warrant is going to have that knowledge to bring all those assets to bear. They're not going to be an expert in all of them, but what they're going to understand, just like the targeting warrants do, they know the right questions to ask to bring in the right specialty. And they can help that OIC, that NCOIC, and ultimately that commander bring all those assets to bear. And frankly, you all know this. The Army runs on relationships. So the reality of having a protection warrant officer be able to talk to a targeting warrant officer and understand how the two are complementary, that's critically important. Because at the end of the day, and we talk about this a lot, we have the protection working group, the targeting working group at Echelon. Oftentimes, there's this make-believe firewall between the two. The reality is they've got to be integrated. Everything you do, no matter where you are on the battlefield, has got to consider both. The example I use in the deep fight, because people say, well, what am I protecting in the deep fight? You're protecting lots of stuff. You may have a fixed bridge site that you don't want taken down by the enemy. You've got to protect that. That's not a fires fight. That's a protection fight. You may have soft deep in your battle space. You don't think they're looking for protection? Likewise, in the core rear area or division rear area, why would I be targeting back there? Well, there may be a level 3 threat that you're not prepared to respond to, that whether it's an ADA asset or a fires asset, you want to target. And that target may be deep, but it may have a protection effect in the rear. So the two of those have to be synchronized and integrated. So at the end of the day, we are very excited about where the protection warfighting function has come and continues to evolve to. But again, I'll kind of end with what I started with. Protection is all of our business. We have got to all understand, whether it's foundational or whether it's operational, they've got to go together because, and I'm not sure what the forum was this morning, I can't remember, but somebody was talking about things like survivability halts or survivability moves, and you'll hear senior commanders say maneuver to fire or protect to fire. It's got to be part of everything we do. It's got to be part of, the days of when, hey, your convoy halts and you know how to pull off to the side and do 360 security. We didn't necessarily do that all over the battle space in the last 20 years. We've got to do that. So again, I would just challenge all of you to think about that. I know we've got some Compo 2 and 3 folks in here, and the other thing I want to talk from a protection perspective for all of you is, so where are we moving forward from a .mil PF perspective? Again, I talked about updating the doctrine. We're really taking a hard look in this next year, and I've gotten outstanding support from General Admiral and the 3-Corps team. We're really going to take a hard look at, you probably have heard about this protection brigade thing, and what the heck is it? Some of you may have heard about a maneuver enhancement brigade, and what the heck, we don't know what that is because it doesn't come to our warfighter when we thought it would be there. Those are two critical formations. And frankly, they're misunderstood formations largely. And I would say from my perspective as Compo 1, I'll talk about the Maneuver Enhancement Brigade or the MEB first. I think Compo 1 often learns incorrect and inaccurate lessons of the Compo 2 and 3 MEBs. So there's 19 of those, 16 in the Guard and 3 in the reserves. And they are a critical formation. Because for those of you that have fought at the division and corps level, you look at the corps rear area, the division rear area, and you don't end up with a headquarters back there that can help run that area and own that battle space. And many commanders, for absolutely, completely correct reasons, they're not going to take a BCT and put it back there. They need that firepower forward. So that MEB is critically important. And what we're trying to do with the protection brigade, and this is where we've got to experiment, is we want to encumber that headquarters. Very similar headquarters, but the MEB is not designed to execute protection. It's designed to synchronize protection, meaning which is largely at a staff level plugged into the core division protection cell. What we're doing with the protection brigade is we're encumbering it with formations. Through the experiment, we're trying to look at two things. One, can we do that? And I won't say a unit size because we don't know, but we're taking a look at engineers, MPs, CBRN, ADA, SEMA, and putting those capabilities underneath that protection brigade. Now, what we don't, and the reason we don't have an icon as far as unit size is, I think we got to look at capability. At the end of the day, when and I'll pick on ADA a little bit, rightfully so. ADA assets are scarce on the battlefield. So to say, hey, I'm going to grab an IFPC battalion and put it underneath a protection brigade, that's probably the wrong answer. But you need to be informed by the threat and the capability you require and then put the right ADA asset underneath of it. And frankly, I would submit the same thing with chemical, engineers, MPs, and SEMA. But you've got to be able to synchronize all those different capabilities. So that's really the difference between the protection brigade and the maneuver enhancement brigade. We're going to experiment with that a little bit this year. Where have we gone? And I think the areas that we have spent the most or had the most success over the last year has been training and leader development. We have spent a lot of time. We've stood up a course called the Protection Integrators Course, which we're running out of Fort Leonard Wood. We did about 1.5 years of pilots with that to pretty good success. But part of our problem in educating the force on what is protection was we hadn't trained the force on what protection was. So we're really, with this PIC course that we call it, it's geared toward division and corps level protection staffs. Let's bring them together and teach them what it is we're talking about and how they need to integrate it. And we spent a lot of time with that. And that's where we think we need to make our most money for the Army. So we're going to move that forward. We put a course in CGSC last year. We're putting a course in our captain's courses, and we're trying to get a course in our Army War College footprint as well. So at the end of the day, we want to be sure that the Army understands what we're talking about. Every commander is going to fight protection a little bit differently. Every commander fights fires a little bit differently. Every commander maneuvers a little bit differently. But we've got to be sure that we train and teach the force to have the general understanding so that they can pivot left and right from a known point. So we're trying to work on that. Again, so I wanted to hit the MEB based on, I know we have some Compo 2 and 3 folks. And so the last piece of this is probably some material gaps that I think our Army may have. And what I owe Army senior leaders is highlighting some of the risk that's potentially out there. Because as they make very, very challenging resource decisions, just want to be sure we're clear on risk. And there's really probably 3 areas from a materiel perspective when it comes to protection that our team is working very hard on to close some gaps that our Army may have. And the first is obscuration. So, and I know I've got some chemical folks in here. So the days of a smoke platoon, yeah, those ended about 10 or 12 years ago. We haven't had a smoke platoon in our formation in a long time. And so the reality is we don't have the ability to do that. But more importantly, for those legacy assets we do have out there, and there are some, that's one element of obscuration. So if we think of obscuration as only smoke, we are missing a lot of the requirements. So we're looking really hard at multispectral obscuration because it's got to take care of all the different capabilities that the enemy may leverage to see us. And so we're looking at that much more broadly. And it's going to take us a little bit of time, particularly as we bring in some of those non-kinetic assets. But we've got great teamwork across TRADOC and CAC from all the centers of excellence. So that's obscuration. We're also working on the next generation of camouflage for the mounted force. So similar to obscuration, we've got to think about it from a multispectral capability. And we're looking at a lot of different system capabilities. Is there a next generation net out there? We're also experimenting with potentially panels that are put on the side of the vehicle. Back to the you may be seen as long as you're not understood. So we're playing with a few different things and what we're looking at under next generation camouflage. And then finally, we're looking at what we call a protection decision support template or protection decision support tool. And really, we see that as two different aspects to it. So the first is, and I say this, and I want to be careful how I say this because everything out there, we put a cop on top of it. Yep, I need a cop for this. I need a cop for that. 27 cops later, the commander's not even sure what they're looking at anymore. But we do think we have a gap in our swing on the protection cop. And it's not because I can pull up many different systems and say, okay, I've got air defense coverage here. I've got chemical coverage here. We can do that for most of our kinetic assets. Where we have a challenge is a lot of our non-kinetic assets. And we oftentimes challenge ourselves through that discussion. Do I have any SEMA folks in here, cyber or space folks in here? Okay, so I am not, nor am I well educated in that. But oftentimes what happens is we overclassify our own discussion. A maneuver commander does not need to know that this is the exact system that we are going to use to create this effect. What a maneuver commander needs to know is this is the effect I need on the battlefield, this is where I need it, and this is generally when I need it. And we don't have an ability clearly to communicate that with all of our different exquisite assets. Again, for a lot of reasons. Some of them are not just Army assets, they're higher level assets. So it's something we've got to take a look at, and what does that protection cop need to provide to a commander? And then the second piece of that is how do we leverage machine learning and AI through a decision support tool to take that cop and make it a cyclic analysis so that, again, we can reinforce to commanders where they may or may not be assuming risk and help recommend a course of action that will mitigate or minimize that risk. So, again, folks, it is my pleasure to be here. I will take any questions from any of you. I truly am honored to be part of this dialogue, but more importantly, I am truly honored to represent the Maneuver Support Center because I'm really proud of the team, and I think what the team is doing is filling a gap that the Army has had in several areas and moving what the Army needs forward. But this is a great time to have this discussion, and again, I'm truly honored to be part of this. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions. If the questions are too hard, Chief Regis will answer them. Yeah.
Hey, sir, CW5 Finney, USOC, CCWO, got a quick comment and then a question.
Sure.
So, my boss talks about it a lot. We've gotten too comfortable with using fires to enable our maneuver. And as we move forward, against near-peer adversaries, we're going to have to maneuver in order to fire. And as you were talking about the protection warrant thing, I don't think we've thought enough about that. So, Dean put me on the list for those first ones. I'll take them. I was looking on the list up here, and I don't know if those are listed by priority. I noticed right up there at the top, CBRN. And I can tell you, when I first came in the Army, probably like a lot of us, we were doing 12-mile road marches with our protective mask. We were learning how to use the atropine, BOP 4 maneuvers in the field. Thank you.
You got to start all over to see if you remember the question.
Yeah, so as I'm looking at that, I'm like, I don't think I deployed with a pro mask in 20 years of GWAT. And as you talked about, we've completely got away from some of those basics in regard to protection. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about where you see the shortfalls in some of our CBRN capabilities at the tactical level and where that capability is going.
Yeah, absolutely, Chief. And so thanks for the question. No, these are not in priority order. The intent of this slide is to show the breadth and depth of the assets that we need to consider from protection. And so, Chief Anderson, what I heard is full support for the protection warrant officer. And so good. So out of this, Chief Regis, we got total Army approval. Well done. So the CBRN question is a great question, and I really, that's an interesting point. So like I said, CBRN is at Fort Leonard Wood. We just recently had our TRADOC Best Squad competition, and it was amazing to me. So I was out there watching the squads go through, and it was absolutely hammered home to me that our 10-level skills have atrophied unbelievably. Even our CBRN folks, hey, how do you do this decon? We don't know. And part of it is, so I'll go back again. So we also have basic training. Part of it is we've got to teach our young men and women in basic training and or AIT, those 10-level skills. But the other piece is we lost as a unit. So I can say as a battalion commander, for example, I know that when my NBC team came to me and said, hey, we need to train on this, I hated that input. But they were really, really good at taking that training. And I said, you can't become the main effort, but you absolutely have to be integrated. And so on both the command side and that CBRN side, we've lost that ability to understand how to make them, hey, I'm marching tomorrow and I've got my mask on. I mean, I did deploy with mine, but because I needed it as a pillow. I mean, that was the only reason we deployed with it. And Chief, I love you. But, at the end of the day, you're 100% right. So, and right now, and this is what I'll speak for the CBRN team that we've got at Leonard Wood, the leadership has spent a lot of time in the last year of getting out to our units, and they're spending less time talking to unit leadership and more time talking to that NBC NCO, because we've got to get that individual, he or she has got to be confident enough to understand how to frame that with a commander. And the other piece is, because the commander may not understand, they've got to, that NBC NCO has got to understand, how do I maintain this kit? Because the CBRN kit is pretty old in many cases. It hasn't reached the top of the priority list for a lot of good reasons. And so in many cases, it doesn't run. Well, if it doesn't run, then I can't train on it, so it becomes so it's a self-licking ice cream cone that we really, again, back to the basics, Sergeant Major of the Army, we've got to start with those 10-level tasks, and then we've got to be sure at the unit level, we're integrating that. Shouldn't be the main effort of training, but it should be part of, hey, you're going to get hit with NBC at this point, or whatever it is. And again, I'll point the finger back at me. I'm not sure that our NBC NCO community at the unit level has the depth of understanding to help drive that. So that's something we're looking really hard at from Fort Leonard Wood, to be sure that they're confident and competent so that they can help train our units. Does that make sense, Chief? Okay, thanks for the question. Absolutely. Absolutely. I screwed up some poor company commander's inventory because I emptied my boxes and found 3 of them one day. I'm like, oop, I'm not supposed to be there. This is being recorded. I shouldn't have said that. Okay, no, great question. Great question. Okay, any other questions? Wow, this is easiest. Yes, Chief.
Sir, Chief Anderson, I do have a question, and it comes from a personal experience, and hopefully, and this is just kind of a wide open question to you, but when I was out, I was a guest speaker at the Sergeant's Major Academy, and I got dug into pretty well on the future of the military police branch and CID, and I think there's a lot of confusion out there. I was just wondering if you could take a few minutes just to kind of level the bubbles on where we're at with that. I think it would be super helpful.
Absolutely,
Thank you,
Chief.
sir.
Thanks for the question. So that's a challenging question because it's an evolving question. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Fort Hood report that came out several years ago, and one of the findings in it was it drove that CID should be its own independent professional agency. And so really in that time between then and now, we, the MP Regiment, has been working very hard to figure out what exactly that means. The Army brought in a lot of new leadership to CID. Not that the old leadership was failing, but just a different viewpoint. And it has really empowered that leadership to own their proponent as CID. The challenge we've worked through is MP training is very, very detailed as far as external agency accreditation. And CID is a large part of that. Whether it's working with NCIS or other service partners that have their own criminal investigative agency. So we have spent the last probably year and a half or 2 years figuring out what does that split look like. What courses do we send to CID? Because we still have an MP requirement for many of them. And the example I'll use is protective services. CID is the proponent for that. There are actually across the Army, by definition, I'll get the number wrong, it's either 14 or 15 high-value positions that require protection. Well, CID does that. But you've all been in units that's led by a 2-star or a 3-star that says, yeah, I want a trained unit taking care of me when we're down range. Yep, that's valid, sir, ma'am, but you're not getting a school-trained capability. So we're still figuring that out a little bit, but the Army published an exord probably about 4 or 5 months ago that defined CID as a specified proponent. And the bottom line is CID is going to handle felony crimes, and the MPs basically handle below that, and then they handle things like detention operations. They handle things like protected logistics on the battlefield. And the challenge and the nuance to that is almost 98% of any criminal activity, whether it's in home station here or home station, downrange in a deployed environment, almost 98% of whatever the activity is, the first responder is an MP, not a CID agent, just because of density. So it's important that we train the MPs to have that proficiency. Otherwise, we screw up the whole investigative process. And we're just trying to figure out where those lines are right now. There's really good discussion between CID and the military police. And we're just trying to be sure that as we put the gap between them, which is important for independence, that we don't create it so wide that we leave something open and uncovered. And I think we're pretty close. TRADOC's been really helpful with ensuring that there's, frankly, a planning team that sits down and talks regularly. We're probably going to start releasing the first courses over to CID to start their education in PME probably in the next few months. So I think we're making forward progress. There's going to be some bumps in the road, but I think we've got a good way forward. And Chief, I'll kind of expand. You didn't quite ask this question, but I'll expand a little bit. The other challenge we've got is for all the right reasons, when you look at the last TAA, and I'll use the MPs as an example, senior leaders were forced to make very tough personnel decisions based on the recruiting reality we had at the time. So the MP regiment lost a lot of population. And I have talked to lots of senior leaders and said, I don't ever fight for more people. It's a finite resource, and senior leaders are making the best decision they can with a limited resource they have. But what we owe the Army, particularly at MISCO, and I could say the same thing of all of my battle buddies to left and right, other COEs, is we owe the Army the risk and the capability. And so that's where we're focused hard, is ensuring that, yep, we created a potential gap for the Army based on decrementing some of those MP units. Well, what's the capability we lost, and how can we potentially get that back, whether it's through an organizational adjustment, a material adjustment, or a combination thereof. So there's some growth amongst CID MPs across the board. Any other questions? Yeah, I'm good. How you doing?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thanks very much for this brief. It really sheds a light on so much, especially where we're going. And I know you've talked a little bit about really where we are today and where we got to go in the future. One of the things with the CBRN that came up was a great question, by the way, because every single one of us that has gray hair out here is thinking the same thing on how we used to train and where we're going. My question is really not on what we're doing, but how we're going to get to the future. And what I mean by that is, here's an example. CBRN, the equipment we have now, well, we know we're going to have to upgrade it. That's a given. But when you take some other areas, area security and force protection, well, when we were in a brigade level fight, that was a different scenario. Now we're division level fight. And my question is how is the maneuver COE really going to tackle the problem of here's gaps from the brigade, and now I got a division, and how am I going to spread that wealth? And I'll do it in the area of force protection, because I know that we're going to have to spread wealth and start working with BCTs in order to figure out the best way to do force protection, for instance. But that also runs into doctrine and equipment. Thank you, sir.
Absolutely, Chief. So that's a great question, and I'll kind of peel it apart a little bit. So first, and I say this because my team hears this all the time, I view force protection and protection warfighting function different, and I'll kind of answer both of those. But I don't think it's any different than the rest of the Army in our approach. The reality is, again, back to tough decisions Army senior leaders are making, what we've got to think through at MISCO, and I had a great opportunity to talk to some of the Army staff yesterday, we've got to think hard about our priorities. And we've got to be sure that we're thinking about different ways to leverage things. So I had the opportunity to sit in one of the regimental discussions a couple hours ago. And one of the things that kept running through my mind, we've got a lot of experimentation going on right now in the Army, whether it's TIC 1.0, TIC 2.0, TIC 3.0. As the engineer community, we're doing a lot of offshoots of those, as everybody else is. And so the reality from our perspective is we have got to think about everything from a .mil-PF perspective. We don't have necessarily a signature investment program where we're getting a ton of money from the Army, and that's okay. It just forces us to creatively think about every problem set. So I have gotten great support from senior leaders like General Rainey when it comes to things like human-machine integration formations for particularly the engineers. Well, the discussion we've had is we cannot myopically think about that from a materiel perspective only. That'll end up, what we'll do is we'll desynchronize ourselves, and then the Army will lose confidence in us. We have got to think about it from the holistic nature of .mil-PF. So yes, when we ask for this piece of kit or we experiment with it, we can't say, oh, I need that toy. No, I need to integrate that in this formation. I need to make an O change this way or a doctrine change this way so that holistically we spit a formation that is functional out on the other end. And that's one of the challenges I think we've got to be sure that we do because, and this is really, and I'll say from our perspective, we at MISCO have to drive this for our 3 regiments in protection because the Army has priority systems, has the key enabling capabilities that they're focused on. Again, I'm not fighting to say we're the most important, but we've got to be nested. And I think something the Army needs to, and I've had this discussion with several senior leaders, as we look at the different variations of TIC, again, when you look at the brigade combat team level, that only integrates so many enablers. But as you step up, what we've got to be sure we do as an Army, in my opinion, is be sure that we're adequately and appropriately integrating all those enabling capabilities. Because what we can't learn as an Army, or more, again, I don't want to say that that made it sound like I have the opinion. From my opinion, what we can't do is we can't learn a maneuver-only lesson. we have got to be sure that we learn an integrated formation lesson. We have got, and whether it starts at the homeland and taking care of us to get us from fort to port, or whether it's fighting forward, we can't learn a lesson based on maneuver only, based on aviation. We have got to be sure that we've got the right sustainment capabilities, the right protection capabilities. And I lump a lot of stuff into that protection category. But we've got to make it we've got to have a guide-on that functions as a unit. And with the division echelon of fighting, the key there is that they have the assets that will power down to the brigades at the right time and place to weight a main effort or ensure success on the battlefield. We've just got to be sure that we've got the right capabilities there. And again, I'll hit the last one you talked about from a force protection and protection perspective. I think we've got to understand the threat not only today, but tomorrow. And that's something that we really need, we continue to think about at the Maneuver Support Center because, again, a lot of our enabling capabilities, we've had some great discussions based on lessons observed in the Ukraine on things like how do we breach? The discussion when there was a threat of potentially using a chemical weapon, that opened a lot of eyes. There's been discussions about things like what happens if there's a tactical nuclear weapon? Do we stop fighting? The answer is no. But have any of you done a warfighter that integrates a tactical nuclear weapon? The answer is no. So it's evolving that thought process to ensure that we're not fighting yesterday's lessons. We're really integrating all of those. So I'm not sure. I want to be sure, Chief, I answered your question. Okay. Again, good question. So for those of you that didn't hear it, how are we leveraging our TTPs from the past, informed by tomorrow, to get to a fighting force that is actually what we need on the battlefield? I think that's generally what you asked, Chief. And I think, again, I'm going to give you Chris Beck's answer. I think the reality is we can't start with a clean slate. You've all heard senior leaders both this week and previously, what makes our Army so successful and so special is the people. And that's not going to change. So the TTPs we started with were largely driven by the people we have, the trained people that we have. Chief, back to your comment about CBRN, we're not going to fix step one of that with kit. We're going to fix step one of that with training. And we have those TTPs. We knew how to do that. I know, and I'll go back to you said it so I can repeat it. Everybody in here who's got gray hair, there were days where we were in MOP 4 for 4, 6, 8 hours during a warfighter. And, if you were a staff officer, you cussed a whole lot in your mask because you were trying to figure out how to hit the damn key with a pencil so you could type. But frankly, a lot of the generation that did that isn't around anymore. So I think it's a balance, Chief. Again, my opinion, I think we've got to start with what we knew. The 10-level tasks that we're asking and training our young trainees to do today, those aren't new. But we shifted our focus based on the threat that we were fighting, and we're just trying to back up to the basics. And so I think if we start with that foundation, and then we really leverage things that we're seeing. You all have heard the CSA say this is the most volatile world he has seen. And so I'll speak for CAC. CAC across all the COEs is aggressively working on both assessments of the ticks and also lessons learned or lessons observed in the operational environment. And I think taking those lessons out and then really being sure that we're not learning something because, hey, this is what worked in Ukraine. We're observing that and bringing it back and saying, okay, what does that mean to how the United States Army fights? And I think right now, aggressively, and I will say very parochially, so I've been in command for about 17 or 18 months. I can't speak to before then, obviously, but I will tell you, for all of you that have ever touched TRADOC, my personal opinion is I think the centers of excellence are working more integrated now than they ever have before. And I think that's really important for our Army because whether it's an aviation asset or a sustainment asset or a fires asset, we all have some semblance of I impact what you do on the battlefield. And I think starting with that foundational back to our roots, TTPs, informed by the operational environment, and then cross-talking, what are the dependencies that I need to think about? I would tell you personally, in my time in the Army, I've never seen it as frankly, as effective as it is right now. So, yeah, Chief.
Hey, sir, Chief Dela Cruz,
Cool.
AFC. Hey, sir, I know you supported Project Convergence in the past, Capstone. Not a question, but a share to the community. Your experience and how you integrated your warrant officers into that culminating event for Army Futures Command, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. And I apologize. You and I talked about that. I will tie not only that comment back to, and I'll tie it back to what Chief Registe and I were talking about recently. So I was really fortunate, and I relied really heavily on my warrant officers, or our warrant officers at 3rd Armored Corps. Like I said, I had 2 targeting warrants, a W-5 and a W-4, that spent the year I was in that job teaching me from day 1 to day 365. And again, what they didn't, and I'll tie this back into the protection warrant as well, what they didn't teach me was, as an officer, what I need to do to synchronize the capabilities. What they did teach me is how to understand the technical aspects and leadership aspects that only they would understand. And so it really helped round out the rest of my learning. And they never walked in and said, sir, you need to be doing this while I'm going to do this. It was a collaborative discussion. So they were absolutely critical to the experimentation. They were critical in saying, yep, this makes sense, or this is going to help what we're trying to accomplish on the battlefield, or no, hey, this may be a cool system, but it doesn't have the right inputs, or it doesn't give me the output that I need to take to develop a course of action where we can recommend something to the commander. At the end of the day, they really knew how to integrate the stuff that I didn't even think about really well. So having that warrant officer sitting next to me, or part of the experiment, or coaching and teaching throughout, and they were also able to come back and say, probably better than I would have ever done, hey, have you thought about this, Mr. Vendor? If you talk from this system to this system, it would decrease our shooter sensor time by 30 seconds. So absolutely integrating them. And the last piece I'll tie it to is what Chief Registe and I talked about. So in particular, again, as the senior commander, I don't have the same level of depth. So we were talking about the cop from protection. And he came into me and said, hey, sir, I think we can do that now. I think we've got a couple systems that we could piece together, and we probably get the right feeds, and we probably won't get the 100% solution, but we can get something out to a warfighter now so that unit can figure out, hey, this works, this doesn't work, gosh, I really need to see this. I would have never thought about that. And in the meantime, my CDID folks, my capabilities development folks, they were doing a great job, but they were plugging away in the way that they know how to do it. And having that CCWO in this case, but having that warrant officer plug in and say, hey, I've worked with these 3 things before. Well, let me just pull them together. I wouldn't have seen that. So it is really, really important. That's another touch point where that coaching, teaching, and mentoring, and frankly, collaboration at the senior leader level is really, really important. So I appreciate that question. Anything else, guys? Okay, well, Chief, as you're coming up, I would, again, I thank you all, but I really would give you guys a call to action as you move forward. One of the things that I've learned from my CCWO is you guys, particularly at this level, many of you have a seat at the table. Use that seat at the table. My challenge to you guys is, so you've all been in the Army at least a day or two. The Army needs the experience you bring to the table and the perspective you bring. So my challenge to you all is use your seat at the table. Don't pass up your seat at the table, and don't take a nap while you're sitting at the table. Because we need you all telling us what we may not be seeing. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity today. Thank you for the questions, and I really look forward to working with all of you.
All right, big round of applause. Sir, you've been very gracious with your time today. Really appreciate the insights and really appreciate the way that you have onboarded Chief Registe and advocate for warrant officers. And so in that, we have a little token of our gratitude, not only on behalf of all the warrant officers assembled here today, but on behalf of the entire cohort. So, sir, we've got a little plaque with a warrant officer inscription on it, as well as your name, and thank you very much. Hopefully you can put that on a desk somewhere and think about your warrant officers.
Thanks, Chief.
Thank you, sir.
Cool.
Appreciate that.
I really appreciate it.
All right, one more round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. Thanks, guys. Thank you. I may scribble out the CW3 just because I still have PTSD about it. Yeah, but other than that, thank you all. Really appreciate the time today. Thanks, guys.
So we have about an hour break. We'll reconvene here at 14:45 for the Army CTO, Dr. Alex Miller, to give us a continuous transformation technology panel.